Hi, I'm Benjamin Ryan, and this is Hazard Ratio. There's a big day coming up in the Supreme Court on January 13th. The justices will be hearing oral arguments regarding a state law in Idaho and another in West Virginia that restricts sports and youth and college students according to biological sex. So there are some really interesting constitutional questions as well as a statutory question at stake, including what level of what's called legal scrutiny applies to transgender people. We saw this also last year in the Skermeti case about pediatric gender transition treatment, about whether transgender people as a class can be subjected to what's called intermediate scrutiny. So, under the Equal Protection Clause of the Constitution, sex in particular is considered a category for which you have to have a higher level, you have to cross a higher bar in order to justify discrimination. So sex categories in sports is an example of something that would cross that bar because there is a valid reason for having those two categories, whereas, say, paying women less than a man for the same job would not. So the plaintiffs in this case are trying to get the Supreme Court to determine that indeed transgender people are a quasi-suspect class, as this is called. Sorry, my cat just meowed. Not now, cat. But it is very unlikely that the court will do this. They rarely ever add new categories. So there's also race, and then there's religion, which are subjected to the highest level of scrutiny under the Equal Protection Clause. So other questions include whether states can draw categorical sex-based lines in athletics without individualized reviews, it's called, and whether excluding transgender girls constitutes sex discrimination in particular, as opposed to just the question about whether they're a quasi-suspect class. And can a law be constitutional in general, but unconstitutional as applied to a specific child? So in preparing for this, I read a book called Fair Game, Trans Athletes and the Future of Sports by Ellie Roscher and Dr. Anna Bayeth. And I spoke with them today, and I want to share with you that interview. It's 40 minutes long, and I think you'll find it very interesting. This point of view from these two authors, I think, will be different than perhaps you're used to. One might describe them as, let's say, radically inclusive. They argue that, indeed, transgender girls should participate in sports, and indeed that actually adds value to sports, that improves the quality of sports for everyone. They call into question whether testosterone really is this miracle drug that we all claim it to be when it comes to strength and speed and that sort of thing. I didn't do a lot of pushing back when I was speaking with them, partly just wanting to be polite. There were time restrictions, but I do want to challenge two things that they said. This notion that there's considerable overlap in the testosterone level between the sexes. There may be outliers, but in general, when you're looking at bell curves, there's a tiny bell curve over on one side with women, and then far over to the other end of the spectrum, there's the normal ranges for men. The normal testosterone range for adult women is 50 to 70, I think it's nanograms per deciliter, and the adult men, it's 300 to 1,000 nanograms per deciliter. Of course, there are outliers. There are people, for whatever reason, may have low or high testosterone respectively, but I would describe it as greatly inaccurate to suggest that there's some sort of overlap at all between the two. And also, the athlete Caster Semenya, who's a South African athlete, identifies as a woman, grew up as a woman, was assigned female at birth, but has a condition which is called 5-alpha reductase type 2 deficiency. So she was born with internal testicles, has no uterus, no fallopian tubes, etc. So she is what I personally would describe as biologically male, although raised as female, I think has every right to be referred to as she prefers. But you will often hear people say, and indeed the authors of this book say, that she has naturally high occurring testosterone. I think that is a misnomer, that in fact she has natural testosterone for being biologically male as defined by having testicles. I personally am an adherent to the definition of biological sex, that it is indeed binary and that it is defined by having your body geared around having either the small or the large gametes. So without further ado, here is my interview with Ellie Roscher and Dr. Anna Bayeth. Well, thanks so much, you two, for joining me. We are talking in part about your book, Fair Game, Trans Athletes and the Future of Sports. But within the context of the upcoming oral arguments at the Supreme Court of the Hecox versus Idaho and BPJ versus West Virginia case about trans inclusion in sports. And then I guess one way to define it is defining sex categories in terms of who can participate in what sports, or otherwise, excluding trans girls from girls categories is another way of putting it. So why don't the two of you just introduce yourselves briefly, just tell me a little bit of your bio and how you came to write this book.
Sure. I can kick us off. I'm Dr. Anna Baith. I use she, her pronouns. And let's see, I have a PhD in kinesiology. I did my doctorate at the University of Minnesota. And while there, I did my doctoral research in the Tucker Center for Research on Girls and Women in Sport. Um, as I was graduating, and getting ready to graduate, a job opened at Athlete Ally, which is a nonprofit that focuses or did focus at the time on LGBTQ inclusion in sport. In the last year, we've shifted a little bit where now we're really focused on allyship in sport,
Mhm. Hmm.
particularly in light of recent changes in higher administration.
So is that
Um,
you're trying to sort of dodge a bullet by changing your focus, or I don't know how specific you want to be.
well, I am our vice president of programs and research. I am
Yeah.
not the leader of the organization.
Yeah.
But yeah, we are trying to ensure that we maintain our relevance.
Yeah. Okay.
Um, so I started working at Athlete Ally and was suddenly inundated with questions about trans athletes and spent about 5 years doing research on trans athletes. So, looking at the science, looking at what we know, what we don't know, um, and of course, looking at some of the political climate and how that's impacting this conversation.
Mhm.
Um, so that's sort of my background in this work, and throughout that process, I met Ellie, and Ellie is a fabulous author and incredibly adept at telling stories and humanizing really complicated issues. And so we put our heads together and wrote this book.
Right.
Mhm.
So Ellie.
Yeah, so my name's Ellie Rocher. I use she, they pronouns, and this is my sixth nonfiction book. My previous book is called The Embodied Path, and I interviewed folks with interesting body stories, interesting things that had happened to their bodies. And I was looking at narrative power and how we tell the stories of our bodies and how that shifts their
Mhm.
relationship to our bodies. And then if we share our body stories strategically, can we press certain levers in society?
Mhm.
I asked Dr. Baith to be one of my sensitivity readers. And there were a couple of trans stories in there that were fascinating to me. I loved listening to how certain trans folks like talked about the embodied experience of being trans. And so that there was something there. And Dr. Baith, said, the research that I'm doing, the data that I'm gathering, it's not shifting anything. I wonder if we work together
Mhm.
to have narrative and good data, what could happen. And so that was the idea of Fair Game. And so we got to sit at the feet of a bunch of trans athletes and
Right.
tell them to tell us the long version of their story.
So there's on page 133, I'm going to read this passage, which it seems to me is essentially your main point, or what we would call in that graph. So you tell me if you agree. So I'll just read it. So the prevailing cultural narrative that trans athletes pose a threat to cis athletes is harmful to trans athletes. There is no evidence that they are dangerous or hostile to their cis teammates. The policies restricting trans athletes in the name of protecting cis athletes stem from the same sexist logic that created sex segregation in sports to begin with. They assume that cis women are weaker than cis men, that trans women have the same biological makeup as cis men, and that trans men have the same biological makeup as cis women. And so, trans men aren't worth worrying about when they compete in men's sports. Let's have a better conversation about safety in sports that leads to more safety in sports for everyone. Would you say that essentially sums it up? Are there other really major top line concept that you want to throw in there just for somebody who hasn't read it?
I'd say that pretty much
Pretty much sums it
hits the
up.
nail on the head. Yeah.
So moving into the court case, so these questions will be pretty technical. So I apologize if, some of the grand scope and all the stories that you were talking about with the different athletes, we don't get to that. But essentially, we're coming to a head, as I see it, with this conflict over what is Title IX, what is it for in this particular context. On one side, there's this idea that essentially sex in the law, the use of the word sex can also or does also mean gender, so that people should or can associate with whatever category, a sex category in sex segregation in sports according to their own gender identity. Or on the flip side, this idea that it's protecting, in particular, the girls or women's category from inclusion by trans women. The idea that biological males, which is a term that I understand that you two probably would not care for, that is used often by people sort of on the other side of this debate, would say that those people, at least in particular people who have been through a male puberty or testosterone-based puberty, don't belong in these categories. So, the law, when it was written, I was interested to learn, was not so much really explicitly about competitiveness, which is opportunity. They wanted to protect opportunity for women. And then the Javits Amendment came along a couple years later that really clarified that you were allowed to have sex segregated sports. And so this idea that's formed about protecting the women's category, protecting women's competitiveness, but the law itself was really written about opportunity. So I'm wondering if you could speak to that idea of opportunity versus competitiveness and how you see those two ideas influencing this debate over these bans in the States.
Yeah, maybe I can kick us off here. So I think it's important to highlight a few key components about Title IX. First of all, it is certainly about opportunity, but it's also really about resources.
Mhm.
Title IX was written not specifically with athletics in mind, but really with a focus on women in higher education. And I can't even really say women because it was the underrepresented sex in
Mhm.
higher education systems. Now, that was, and it did ultimately apply to athletics, particularly at any institution that receives any form of federal funding. So that's pretty much
Pretty much
every high
everywhere.
school and
Yeah.
college in the United States. And sport really kind of became the poster child for Title IX. We saw this explosion of girls participating in sport for the first time, though when we look at the numbers, the number of women who are participating in sport currently is still lower than the number of men who were participating in sport in 1971, right before Title IX was
Hmm.
passed. So the effectiveness or I would say maybe efficiency of that is somewhat up for debate
Mhm.
in some capacities. Regardless of opportunity, though, the primary driver was really to say not only do we need to focus on creating opportunities for women or the underrepresented sex, but we really need to focus on ensuring that they have equal resource allocation
Mhm.
into those systems. Now,
And
I
you hear
keep
all
saying
about, they had that terrible gym and the guys at the great gym, and they get all
Yeah,
the
yeah.
new uniforms. The girls are wearing somebody's throwaway clothes, that stuff.
Yeah. Yeah, and we're still seeing a lot of cases. I mean, most scholars presume that 90% of athletic departments aren't in compliance with Title IX
Mhm.
still. Um, and the NCAA was subject to a really interesting lawsuit around that
Mhm.
recently.
Especially in terms of
Um,
resources, just how much money is spent in
yeah,
particular. Yeah,
yeah.
I'm sure.
Yeah. So this idea of sort of interpreting sex as either sex or gender is really curious to me, mostly because when we talk about Title IX, everyone sort of assumes when we say the underrepresented sex, we're always talking about women
Mhm.
compared to men.
Mhm.
That isn't really true. That's not how the law is supposed to work. And it's not even a law, it's an educational amendment. So it's pretty
Mhm.
frail in terms of our legal system. Um, but so the argument goes by some folks' reasoning, we should be saying, okay, well, then let's focus on the underrepresented gender. And the idea would be people with an underrepresented gender identity. Others are saying, let's keep it the term sex. And the idea really then is it has been leveraged, Title IX in this, I would say, niche distinction has been leveraged to really say, okay, some of us believe that sex is biological and that no trans athlete should participate in sport. Some people are saying trans athletes should participate in sport. Now, that's not really what we're talking about when we talk specifically about the language of Title IX, but that is how it's being interpreted.
Well, so that moves into my next question is how do you define sex and gender respectively?
Ellie, you want me to go or would you like
No,
to?
I'll go. I'll go.
Hey,
Go
Ellie,
ahead.
go
So,
ahead.
Yeah,
I
I
do.
didn't know if you wanted to.
So, like, I used to think about gender as being a performance and that being really, really dynamic and that it could change moment to moment, day by day. And I thought about sex as static. But in doing the research for this book and in listening to the stories of trans athletes, I've really come to respect sex is way more varied and way more dynamic and way more interesting than I was previously given credit for. And so I do think of both gender and sex as something that shifts and changes. My sex is my chromosomes, my hormones, my genitalia, my gonads, my secondary sex traits. And in that regard, it's so complex where I don't know a whole lot about some of those things, right? So we have made the conversation be almost exclusively about testosterone. But I don't know what my testosterone levels are. And when we look at testosterone levels with cis men and cis women, there is quite a bit of overlap. I've always been able to form muscle very quickly. I have coarse hair on my chin. I didn't menstruate until college. Like there's some interesting things about my body and its experience of sex that I didn't think about until now. We're trying to figure out how to maintain this category. That's a lot more variant than we want to give it credit for. That sex isn't, scientists would often say like a bimodal model is more is more accurate and gets us better data than a two bucket. But our sports system is still holding on to this starch binary, and there's certain bodies that are then perceived as deviant or kind of cogs in the system.
So what's your opinion of a gamete-based definition of sex that there are two sexes? One is a body designed around producing the small gamete, and one is designed around producing the large one, and that there's no third sex. No one has both. What's your opinion of that definition?
I don't think I don't think that has been effectively proven within empirical research. But that aside, I think the larger question for me is in what ways does it matter? And in what ways is sex or gender relevant to athletic ability,
Right.
athletic performance,
Which is my next
whatever it
question.
might be? Yeah.
Yeah.
So in this context, do you believe, or is your understanding of the available research that on average, men are stronger and faster than women and would beat them in most athletic disciplines? There are going to be some differences. I used to do ballet, so women tend to focus more on sort of fine-tune things, fouettes, that sort of thing. Men do bigger jumps, etc. But in general, do you agree? Do you think there is evidence to suggest that men are on average stronger and faster?
I wish we had that much data on
Mhm.
sport as a sport scholar. Um, I think the short answer is for me, the question is less around gender specific or sex specifically and athletic ability and more around what impacts athletic ability. So, what we know is, of course, having some physiological advantages come into play in certain sports, right? In fact, height is the greatest predictor of athletic ability if you were to choose one factor, right? And yet we don't have policies around height in
Mhm.
sport, which I find curious.
Yeah, I've talked about this with
Um,
people. This idea you could have height limits and height categories in basketball if you wanted. You could have a 5'10" and under basketball league, but we don't.
yeah,
One
but we
person I
don't.
spoke to said that we have certain categories, sex categories, and we have weight categories and things like boxing, because it is the way we decide as a society what we want to value and celebrate. That's how we separate things. So we could decide we want to celebrate specific height categories, but we don't. It's just these things are arbitrary, but they're decisions that we've made. So there's tension here in how we want to decide what we want to value when it comes to segregation in sports.
Mhm.
Precisely. And I think something that people don't often talk about, and frankly, I'm not quite sure if this is in the book directly, but something that we have been talking about are the variables that do impact athletic ability, or really how far somebody will go with their athletic career.
Mhm.
When we look
Money.
at people, exactly,
You think about the Olympics and you're
Money.
precisely.
like, gee, how come some countries have hundreds of athletes and others have two? It's like
Ah,
money. And
GDP.
why do the Chinese do really well? Well, they have state-sponsored athletics. So these people can afford to train all day long. So
Money. Yeah.
Precisely. Precisely. And
Yeah.
in the United States, we don't have a system like
right.
China where we select athletes.
Yeah.
We have sport governing bodies
But
Yeah.
most
and
most
other
Olympians
systems
are
that
like
do it for
destitute. They're
us.
working fast
That's right.
food. They're just
Yes.
trying to get by.
Yes.
That's right.
Yes.
Yeah.
When I think about in Katie Barnes' book, Fair Play, they
Mhm.
talk about figure skating and the difference between the two categories, like the
Right.
figure skating and the women's figure skating. Who decided that a quad jump was harder and more
Mhm.
impressive than some of the like more intricate spin, right? And it's just
Right.
like who's making the rules, who's placing, and I competed in two sports that are interesting in the fact that the different sex versions are different. So gymnastics, right?
Right.
Think about a Simone Biles. Like very few people would argue that she's not the single most athletic gymnast
Mhm.
in the world, right? Even though she's a woman. But the events are different, which is interesting. Like
Well, they
different,
changed the scoring system to value what she could do,
she's
essentially, to show her
fascinating.
off, and it
She's
changed
fat.
everything.
That's right.
Have you seen 16 Days of Glory, that old documentary by Bud Greenspan about the 1984 Olympics? If you get the Criterion channel, it's on there right now. It's fascinating. And what I didn't know is that the 1984 was the first year for a women's marathon, for one thing.
That's
Yes.
right.
And I
Yes.
asked ChatGPT, I said, well, how would Mary Lou Retton do these days in the Olympics? Like, oh, she wouldn't even make it into the Olympics. It's gone so far beyond that.
Well,
The
and this
shift
is,
was the scoring system, right? That
Yeah.
like used to
Mm.
train obedient little girls who are white to be perfect and
Yeah.
get it done. And now the shift in the system
Mhm.
is what allows Simone Biles to be the best in the sport. And
You
so
read that
she,
book, Little Girls in Pretty Boxes?
yeah, yeah,
oh,
yeah.
Or is
yes,
it Pretty Girls in
Fascinating.
Little Boxes? I can never remember. But the
Yeah, yeah.
making of elite figure
one and the
skaters and
same.
gymnasts. I wouldn't watch the Olympics in 1996 because of that book. I was so horrified.
Totally, totally, totally.
And I think, thinking about, say, Title IX and how that
Mhm.
ties in, something that I think we also don't talk about often enough is the element of time and
Mhm.
the fact that
Yeah,
women have not really been permitted to be elite athletes until
that's
the
right.
last, in some sports, 10
Mhm.
years, at most 50 years. And so
Right.
there's actually a new book by Cherie Becker and Stephen Mumford where they talk about the element of time and how in 50 years, the estimation is that women, in theory, will catch up to where men are today. We're just behind.
Well, that
So,
goes back to
So,
money
mm,
too, right? Like
yeah,
yes,
who has the time and the
right.
privilege, not only
right.
to get access to great coaching and facilities, but can not be working, right,
Mhm.
in order to be training, that has historically been men.
So maybe I'm wrong. What I have read is that was an open question in 1970 when Title IX was passed, was whether women who had been given no opportunities when growing up in school. My mother was born in the mid 40s. She told me that when she was growing up, girls weren't allowed to play full court basketball because they believed that their uteruses would fall out. It sounds like a joke, but they really did believe this.
Right.
So it is my understanding that these questions were essentially closed by the 90s when essentially the times reached an asymptote and we realized that women are always going to be just this far from men. There's going to be a gap in elite athletics. So are you essentially arguing that we haven't reached the end of that asymptote in terms of the capabilities of women's bodies and different elite sports in particular?
Yes, I love the way that you
Yes.
phrase that.
Okay, well,
Yes.
Thank you. Yes,
Yeah, so
that
keep
is what
going.
we were saying.
And
All right.
the interesting sports where the sex and gender arguments just fall away, right?
Mhm.
Like the story of the clay pigeon
Right.
shooter, right?
Yeah.
Like who won the 92 Olympics, and then there were gender categories because
Right.
she won, right? Or ultra running, where like if you once you reach a certain distance, the
Women.
sex categories just fall away, right?
Mhm.
We're seeing really interesting things happen with ultimate frisbee. So it's
I
complicated.
tried playing that once. It was terrible. I found it very uniquely humiliating. But
Oh, I'm
also,
sorry.
there were also mosquitoes everywhere, and I was being bitten.
Oh,
That
yeah.
that
No.
Um,
Yes.
so this book, you really cast doubt on testosterone as the end all be all, the source of strength.
Yeah, yeah.
How would you characterize your perception of what testosterone does and does not do when it comes to fueling strength and ability in sports?
Yeah. Stardust Bath.
Yeah, I think that there is a vast overinflation of what testosterone does and does not do. I think whenever we choose one particular component of a very broad, large organic system, we're not taking into account the system itself,
The
right?
body,
So
by system, you mean the body.
the body, yes, I'm
Yeah.
sorry. So for instance, right, when people, I always find it curious that people like to talk about testosterone levels, but they don't talk about testosterone receptors in the
Hmm.
same bodies.
Hmm.
When we look at, athletes who have, particularly when we look at women athletes who have very high levels of testosterone, this has become a very contentious issue, right? Caster Semenya, case in point. What's most curious to me about those athletes is um, they have high levels of testosterone because their bodies are actually not receptive to testosterone.
Well, correct me if
So
I'm
they're
wrong, but
not really
Caster
utilized.
Sinen, I can't pronounce her last name. It's Semenya.
Semenya.
Does she have undescended testicles? Is that correct?
I'm not sure, and I don't know that that has been. I haven't read
Yeah.
about that. I
Okay.
mean, I've really focused on
It's my understanding
testosterone
that
levels.
the idea of a naturally high testosterone is that she has an intersex condition such that she has internal
Mm.
testicles. I could be wrong.
It may be the case,
Mm.
but I again, I mean, what I find so interesting is that she has very high testosterone because her body
Mhm.
doesn't actually utilize that testosterone.
Mhm. Right.
So again, I mean, this just really raises some pretty big questions for me about why we are focusing
Mhm.
on one component of what
Mhm.
is a very complicated body in a very complicated system, which is sport.
Mhm.
And then beyond that, when you look at the studies around testosterone, they are um, not applicable to
Mhm.
elite sport, as most of the researchers who have done those
Mhm.
studies have said.
Yeah. We're
Well,
studying the wrong age
go
group.
ahead.
We're studying the wrong, like testosterone changes in the course of
Mhm.
the day, in the course of your lifetime,
Mhm.
right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, is your opinion that while small, perhaps small, is there a difference in athletic competitiveness between prepubescent boys and girls?
Is there a difference between prepubescent boys and girls?
Like
Is that what you
athletic
asked?
competitiveness, strength, grip strength, speed, that sort of thing.
No, I mean, most studies are very clear about how that works. The bigger question is really around age.
Mhm.
Yeah.
So,
Okay.
no.
And then for post-pubescent people who have been through testosterone puberty, does sustained testosterone suppression and estrogen treatment mitigate any advantage that might have occurred because of that puberty? What is your take on that question? What we know about it?
My take is we don't know. There isn't empirical data. That said, what I have read does make it clear that testosterone suppression and or estrogen use, I mean, whatever sort of gender forming hormone treatment is applied does have a very significant impact
Mm-hmm.
on strength, speed, stamina.
Mm-hmm.
Um,
Would that not, though, contradict what you said earlier about testosterone not necessarily having that much of an impact on strength, speed, and stamina?
well, I think testosterone most readily impacts recovery,
Mm-hmm.
actually. I think it's also, it's really complicated when you look at the research for a few reasons. First, n- none of these studies look at trans athletes.
Mm-hmm.
There is one study that looks at trans folks in the military, but most of the studies are comparative analyses between cis men and cis women. So we don't really know how gender identity, the psychological components of that, and the social components of that, and I would argue the social components that impact training, are influential to somebody's physical abilities. The other part, the other incredibly complicated part about this is because of all of the laws that have now been passed, there aren't very many trans kids participating in
Right.
sport. There aren't going to
Hard to
be very
study.
many
Mm-hmm.
trans adults participating in sport over the next 30 years. So I don't know that there will ever
Mm-hmm.
be research that can prove
Right.
anything.
So I think there was a stat you referenced where perhaps 25% of trans kids participate in sports. What's, at least before these bans were passed, what was your understanding of that level of participation?
Yeah, so that statistic came out of a study that was conducted between the Inclusion Playbook and some scholars at the University of Connecticut. And that study, I believe, and I might not get the year quite right, I think it was in
Mm-hmm.
2016. Um, so they found that, yeah, about a quarter of trans kids participate
Mm-hmm.
in sport. So when you look at the number of kids who participate in sport writ large in this country, talking about 6 million or so,
Mm-hmm.
you less than 1% of all of those kids identify as transgender.
Right.
And so if you
Well,
actually extrapolate
the
down, the
CDC
numbers
found that
are
about
small, small.
3.3% of adolescents identify as transgender right now, which something I think the Williams Institute has estimated that perhaps 300,000 adolescents identify as transgender. So would it not be about 75, let's just say 75,000 kids out of 6 million, so a little over 1%?
Yeah, it might be closer to that.
Mm-hmm.
Some of the statistics they're shifting because a
Mm-hmm.
lot of, for two reasons. First, because a lot of those studies have now started considering non-binary identities
Right.
as
It's tricky.
part of the trans umbrella.
Right.
So the numbers are a bit larger.
But so does your book, for that
Yeah,
matter. Yeah.
yeah, right. And I will say, I think the other part of this that sort of came right on the heels of us writing this book was that uh, when COVID happened, more and more kids were no longer in school and no longer under the pressures of gender conformity
Mm-hmm.
in some ways. And we saw a fair number of young people identifying and coming out as trans for the first time.
Right. So tell me what you think of this argument. I've heard it sort of, there's this argument, why is everyone focusing so much on this very small percentage or number of children who are participating in sports? This is all one big moral panic. It's just a wedge issue for Republicans to drive up the polls and red meat for their base. On the flip side, though, you could say the same thing about book bans. It's, 0.001% of all books in the library. Why are we focusing on it? I think each side would say it's the principle. So what do you say to that particular argument that what's important not so much is the number of people doing it, but the principle at stake, the idea of fairness and how we define that,
Yeah.
or the powers that
Well,
be define it in any case.
right. I mean, I think that if we want to talk about fairness, then let's talk about the most athletes who are most impacted by unfair systems.
Mhm.
And in my estimation, that is almost all women and girl athletes, athletes of color, and athletes who come from less affluent homes, households,
So I think
areas
you're
of the
talking more
country.
about the opportunity question in particular here. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah,
Your
I mean, I
fairness is
think
the fairness of opportunity to the point of what Title IX was written for, in fact.
yes, yes. And what is the point of um, sport or the question of fairness? If we're talking about safety, then I am much more concerned, frankly, with sexual assault and the rates at which that is happening in sport than I am with trans athletes. So if we want to talk about fairness, we want to talk about safety, we want to whatever the concern is, or that moral question. Um, I'm questioning why trans athletes in every single case,
Yeah.
or with every single issue, if that makes sense.
When I'm thinking
So
about
go
the
ahead.
time, the time and the resources that would go into maintaining the
Mm.
female category, where could that time and money be put into
Mhm.
to actually build equity in sport?
So, as you understand it, under the Javits Amendment, which clarified the meaning of Title IX when it came to the sports in particular, what do you see as the purpose of the female category in that context?
Well, I think the purpose of in that context and at that time, I believe that it was created so that women's sport had the opportunity to grow and develop unhindered for the first time. And I can't even say unhindered. It's also important to know that a lot of what was pushed there was actually from the men's sports community.
Hmm.
They didn't want women to be anywhere near men's sports. And so they said, fine, women, you can have your own category. Um, so again, I mean, at the time, I think it was really about cultivating women's sport um, under the model of what was men's sport at the time,
Mhm.
which also a lot of scholars argue that we could have done it differently.
Mhm.
Um,
Well, you really
that
seem to
said,
argue in your book that sports should not be sex segregated. Is that true? Is that your belief?
I don't think that that is
Mhm.
the belief. I think
You
that
certainly
if
call into
we,
question sex segregation. Like
yeah,
how in an ideal world, how would you arrange things when it came to segregation in sports?
I think it's a really hard question to answer because we're simply not in a place
Yeah.
where people have had equal opportunity in sport. I mean, I think the first step would be to say, let's take money out of it and let's give everyone access to sport.
Mhm.
That would be the first part of it. And for that matter, I would argue give everyone access to physical education,
Mhm.
which is really a problem in this country.
Mhm.
So I would start there. And I would say, let's make sport safe for everyone in terms of, are you being harmed by leaders in sports spaces, either psychologically or physically, or emotionally? And I would start there and kind of see how it plays out.
Yeah, I think we need a way, like a very nuanced long-term plan toward desegregation. It depends on the age, it depends on the sport. Um, but for example, you brought up pre-puberty, like when kids can play together, let that happen.
Mhm.
Um, because so much socialization happens in that
Mhm.
arena. And some really, really interesting things could happen if we let
Mhm.
all kids play together.
So, speaking of fairness again, I think a lot of people just took one look at Leah Thomas and said that's not fair, or they see. So, in the Washington Post last few days, there was an article by Casey Parks you probably saw about Veronica Garcia, the runner, the 400-meter runner from Washington State, transgender girl. And Riley Gaines posted a video of Veronica winning the 400-meter last year by several meters. And the article in the Washington Post says that she had only been under testosterone suppression for maybe a few months. It didn't actually say when she started, but the race was in May, and she said the article said she first inquired about that treatment at the beginning of the year. So it was no more than, let's say, 5 months. I think most people look at that image of this transgender girl far ahead of the other girls by many meters in an only 400-meter race and say that's not fair. What do you say to that response?
Um, I will say I am not familiar. I am not intimately familiar with that
Okay.
story. But I will say, um,
She was a 16-year-old girl transgender girl who won the 400 meter in Washington State championship by several yards, and then
mm,
won it again the following year. And so
mm,
there was a big article in the Washington Post over the weekend about her story. And she'd come from, to your point, she'd come from poverty. Her shoes didn't even fit. Her mother, she became homeless eventually. So this is somebody who had had this very little opportunity.
yeah, yeah. I think I I would say first, I think it is complicated when those are the only stories that we're hearing and seeing.
Hmm.
Um, I have worked with and studied trans athletes for a long time, and there are many other stories. That said, the question of is it fair, is it not fair? I think that raises the question for me of is sport fair at
Hmm.
all? And as a coach and sports scholar, I would say no, it's not. That's part of what we love about sport.
Hmm.
We love that people can have competitive advantages.
Well, if
The
you're
question,
throwing away the notion of fairness, then why ban doping?
well, I think the idea of doping is a very different one, and there are a lot of different types of
Hmm.
doping.
Let's just take
Um,
taking steroids. The East German swimmers, and I forget when it was, and you see them, they came in, they were very muscular, and they all won. It turns out they were all taking steroids.
mhm. I mean, again, I didn't create the systems
Hmm.
of sport, but I
Hmm.
think the bottom line is we need to be more clear about what we are saying
Hmm.
when we are talking about fairness and who gets advantaged in those systems and who doesn't. I mean, I find it interesting that you look at Michael Phelps,
Hmm.
he has
Perfect
many,
body, perfect swimmer's
many
body. Hmm.
genetic advantages, right? He wins by a body length in elite
Hmm.
sport, the highest
Hmm.
level, and nobody's questioning it. They're
Hmm.
celebrating it. They're saying, wow, this is so amazing that he's from the US, right?
So we're gonna get cut
But
off by the cutoff
yeah.
of Zoom. So maybe each of you just 20 seconds wrapping up real quick. Sorry about the 40-minute cutoff. Ellie, do you want to?
Sure.
Yeah.
I mean,
Hmm.
I think the bottom line for me is um, it's a complicated conversation, right? We're talking about complicated issues. Sport is a major, major system. It's culturally upheld in this country. So let's have a nuanced
Hmm.
conversation
All
about
right.
it.
Ellie?
Yeah, complicated, create pathways for play.
Great.
Yeah.
All right. Well, thank you so much for talking today and for your book. I'm sorry we're getting cut off like this. I'd love to keep talking, but
Yeah. Thanks
Yeah.
so much.
all right.